Hi, my name's gwEm and welcome back to my YouTube channel, the gwEmbassy. So tonight I wanted to compare two famous Roland drum machines, the Roland TR-909, which comes from 1983, and the Roland TR-707, which started to be reviewed at the end of 1984, but I think it was 1985 when it really became available. Both machines share a very similar grey, beige and yellow colour scheme. They really do look like brothers, and they were both predominantly used in the house movement of the late 80s. But after that, the two took very different career paths. The 909, by virtue of its fat kick drum, became a house and techno staple really, and the 707 has sort of been forgotten a little bit. Now the 707 is my favourite drum machine, but even I must admit that the massive kick drum on the 909 is quite a selling point. On the second-hand market these days, the 909 costs anywhere between £2,500 and £4,000, and the 707 is about 10% of that. But briefly, in 1985, both machines were available, new, and the 707, because of its sampled drum sounds, they thought it sounded much more realistic, and they thought that it was an advancement in technology, and that was the one to go for. But let's look at it now again, with the benefit of hindsight. Which of these two drum machines really is the best?
Let's talk a little about the appearance of these two boxes. So the 909 has a metal case with plastic side pieces, whereas the 707 is completely plastic. So the 909 is definitely better built, but as you can clearly see, the 909 is quite a lot larger and less portable. The colour schemes are very similar on both machines. They've got this kind of greyish beige with dark grey and orangey yellow text that I think looks very much of its era and absolutely brilliant. Now the 909 does have the ability to tweak the sounds. That you've got quite a lot of control on the bass drum and snare drum, but you do tend to find that there's only really one sweet spot that you get with the bass drum. And it's similar with the snare drum, although the tone, which adjusts the length of the snare, is quite useful. Generally, with all these other sounds, there's a sweet spot where you end up leaving them. So it's a bit of a false promise, the ability to tweak the sounds on the 909. On the 808, you do get lots of very useful variation, and you don't end up leaving the controls in one position. But on the 909, you do quite often end up just using the same sounds all the time. Now the 707, you can't change the sounds at all, so that's clearly a negative. But what it does have is these sliders to adjust the volume of each instrument, and that's incredibly useful for jamming. If you practice, you can learn how to quickly do mute and unmutes with your fingers and rotating the pots, but it's not the same as just being able to quickly flick on and off each sound with the sliders. So it's probably controversial, but I think I give the controls the win on the 707. Now, in terms of the display, the 707 has this really nice big LCD display with the tempo, and you can view your pattern, and you know exactly what is going on. Now the 909 has this rather cryptic 3/7 segment display. If you hold down things, you can see what the tempo is and adjust that. For example, if you want to change the MIDI sync or the DIN sync, you can press the tape sync button here, but it's not very clear what you're actually selecting. So the 707 definitely gets the win for usability. The 909 has these really cool high quality push switches to turn on and off steps and to select various things. Whereas the 707 has these cheaper switches which feel fine to be fair, but when you're comparing against the ones on the 909, they're definitely far better. Which brings me onto the accent. So with the 909, you've got an accent or two different volume levels for the bass drum, snare drum, all the toms, and the closed hi-hat. Now, the 707, all the volumes for your sounds, they are the same, but there is a global accent that you can set a bit like an 808, and that step is then played louder on all of the instruments. The 909 has a global accent as well, so it seems like you've got more versatility having accents on the individual sounds and a global accent as well. But I kind of just prefer the simplicity of having a single global accent. Let's talk about the number of patterns you can store. So the 707 has 4 groups of 16 patterns, and the 909 has 3 groups of 16 patterns, but you get 2 banks, bank 1 and 2. And furthermore, the 909 does allow you to sequence external MIDI instruments with it. I've done a separate video about it, but basically you can sequence 16 notes polyphonically and at the same time have your drum patterns. So the 909 has more patterns, and it also has the external instrument track, so it definitely trumps the 707 there. Both of these machines have been given a handsome number of audio outputs. So they've both got a mono and a stereo output, and they've both got individual outputs for all the drum sounds. They both have the ability to increase the storage with this cartridge, and the 909 has the cartridge on the back. So that is all the same, but there are some differences in the input and output. The 909 has a built-in power supply, and you can see it's using a kettle lead here. The TR-707 takes a 12-volt input, which is a bit annoying, but there are worse things than that. The 909 has 1 MIDI input and 2 MIDI outputs, whereas the 707 just has 1 input and 1 output. The 909 has a DIN sync 24 input only, whereas the 707 has a DIN sync input and output. It's shared on the same port, but it is an input and an output, and you can use it to go between each type of sync method. And one thing that the 707 is very often used for is as a clock master, because it has a MIDI and a DIN sync output. So that is a win for the 707. Unfortunately, neither box has a MIDI through, which is a real pity. The 909, unfortunately, has a few annoying bugs in its MIDI implementation. So the version 1 of the firmware doesn't always sync properly to MIDI clock. And this particular one is a later 909, which has a version 4 firmware. But even with this, I'd noticed that sometimes with connecting via MIDI, it can sometimes cause the sequencer to hang. That's never happened to me on the 707. A lot of people say it's better to use the DIN sync input on the 909 as it's a lot more stable. And I guess it makes sense, because at the time, DIN sync would have been the mature technology. It's not necessarily a problem. You can work around it, but it's something to be aware that the 909 does have a few issues associated with MIDI sync. Let's compare the sounds of the 707 and the 909. First of all, we'll do the kick drum. The 909 has that classic big thumping kick drum that we've heard so many times. And the 707 has a more realistic sounding kick drum, but Some people do think it sounds like a basketball being bounced on a concrete wall, and I can kind of see what they mean. I think probably the 909 does have a better kick drum, as much as I'd like to say that the 707 has a better kick drum. You can process the 707 kick drum to make it sound better, but let's just compare the sounds as they come out of the box. Let's do the snare drum now. The 909 has a very iconic, aggressive sounding snare I really like. But the snare of the 707 isn't too bad either. I think it would be fair to call this one a draw, but I'm sure many people will prefer the snare on the 909. Let's do the toms. Again, I'd like to call this one a draw. I do definitely prefer the toms on the 707, but the toms on the 909 have that classic analog tom sound, and they do sound really good as well. The next sound is the rim shot. And I do actually prefer the rim shot on the 909 by quite a bit. At this point, the 707 has a sound that the 909 doesn't, which is the cowbell. And then we have the hand clap. And I think they both sound really good. Actually, I really like the 707 hand clap, and I do prefer it, but there's nothing wrong with that analog 909 hand clap. It has a nice long tail on it. Sounds very good. And then the 707 has another sound that the 909 doesn't, which is the tambourine. Then it's closed hi-hat. Very similar sounding, and I think we can call that a draw. Let's do the open hi-hat. Again, quite similar sounding. I sort of prefer the 909, but there's really nothing in it. I'm definitely calling that one a draw. Now, the crash and the ride have a very similar circuit within both drum machines. Some people even say that they sound identical with the pitch set correctly, and that's sort of true. But if you compare the ROM data for the crash and the ride on the 909 against the crash and the ride on the 707, they are actually different. But I have a feeling they might just have sampled the exact same cymbals. Sounds pretty much identical, doesn't it? And let's do the ride. Really hard to say. Now let's compare the swing of the two drum machines. Now this obviously won't be a fair test because they're running different sounds, but you might be able to judge the groove and the feel of them. A lot of people say that the 707 has a really special sounding swing, and I kind of agree, but let's see what you think. Here's the 909 first. Okay, that's the 909. Let's do the 707. I really do like the swing on the 707, but it sounds good on the 909 as well. I don't know, I just think that 707 does have the edge on that one.
So there we are, 707 versus the 909. Let's imagine it's 1985 and you go into a music shop and you want to buy a Roland drum machine. Do you spring for the larger 909 even though it's about twice the price? Or do you save your money and go for the more modern TR-707? For me, it's not entirely clear. Of course, we all know that now a TR-909 will go for 4 times the original purchase price, whereas a 707 will go for slightly under what the original purchase price was. I think you'd find it quite a difficult decision to choose. Let me know in the comments what you would go for. Consider liking the video if you would, and it would be even better if you could subscribe to the channel as well. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you in another video soon.